Hello, and thanks for joining us again on the Nutrition, Health and Performance podcast with me, Jamie Pugh. I've got another fantastic guest lined up for you today. It's actually the first person that we've had back for a second time. So the first one proved to be one of the most popular podcasts we've done so far. And given his huge area of expertise, we've asked Dr. Nigel Plummer to come back for a second time round. For those who didn't catch the first episode, I'll very quickly give you a rundown of who Nigel is. I'm sure he'll do a better version of his own introduction. But he had his completed his doctorate in microbial physiology in the University of Surrey. He's worked on antibiotic research and development. He's currently does a lot of research in the use of the microbiome and normal flora in the prevention and treatment of different diseases. Uh, got continues to do lots of research, funded some of the research we've done at Liverpool John Moores, and that some of that's in probiotics, natural antimicrobials, fish oils, collaborated all over the UK and Europe as well. So for what we're going to talk about today, really is one of the top people in the know. So first of all, Nigel, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Jamie. Doing very, very well, thank you. And you?
Not too bad. If people see the dates this come out, we'll try and steer away from politics, maybe as best we can.
It's always a good idea. It's always a good
That's
idea.
definitely the thing that's taken a lot of my focus and attention the last couple of days. I'm doing my best to swerve it. How are you? How are you coping with the lockdown and other things like that? Obviously, people will know the sort of business that you're in. Is it much of an effect, or are you managing to cope pretty well?
Well, we've been fortunate in that once the lockdown was announced, we were included in what was, I suppose, defined and classified as being essential industry, and so we've managed to stay open and operational all the way through. And I mean, it's been a little bit challenging because we've had to modify a lot of our practices of our production lines so that we can affect a satisfactory level of social distancing and reassurance of staff that we are doing that has been very important. Because I think a lot of staff, not just with us, but generally were really a little bit spooked by the lockdown and the threat of the coronavirus. But the measures that we've put in place, I think, have been effective, and I think that's mirrored in other companies across the UK. But it is almost like a permanent change now. We don't see that the social distancing measures that they're going to disappear anytime soon. So yeah, I think we're stuck with it, but we're dealing with it. As I say, compared to a lot of other industries that have been forced to close, we've been very, very fortunate. So I'm pleased about that.
No, fantastic news. And that's, well, I suppose we can almost jump straight into one of the areas that we want to speak about today. So, we've asked you to come on, maybe not to speak specifically about COVID-19 coronavirus, but more about infectious diseases in general. And I suppose, how much of our risk or health can we modify maybe through diet and nutrition. So separate issues to long-term health and inflammatory diseases and things, those types of conditions. So in terms of maybe it's quite a broad question to start, our risk of falling ill from an infectious disease, is that risk changeable between people? Is this something that we can mitigate beyond just, as you said there, social distancing from our own health? Can we do that?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things just to sort of preempt that a little bit in that whilst we've been in the last couple of months, whilst we've been on lockdown, and just prior to that, as the sort of spectre of coronavirus started to grow, I mean, what we were seeing was a significant growth in demand for immunity based supplements. So whether that was vitamin C, vitamin D, probiotics, and so forth. So I think it is relevant and really anything that has got immunity and immune on it, and that's the sort of, I suppose, in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to do here. Is we're trying to enhance and support the immune system, and And if you pare it down in terms of what the immune system does, its main function is to protect against infection and infectious disease. If you were to single out one single primary function that the immune system has, it's protection against infectious disease. And I mean, it has other functions as well, in that it has a function in terms of wound healing and tissue healing. It has a function in terms of surveillance of potentially tumorigenic cells, and it maintains immune tolerance. But in terms of the primary function of our immune system, it's protection against infection. So it's really, really important. And then when you look at that, what increases susceptibility or not, there's a number of things that may affect somebody's susceptibility to infectious disease. There's the genetics of the person. There's, if you like, the age of the person. So people who are babies and the elderly tend to be more susceptible to infectious disease because the reason for that is because their immune system in neonates and young children, for instance, hasn't developed properly or hasn't developed to its fullest extent, and in the elderly, it's declining. And so, for both of those reasons, those two ends of our lifespan, for instance, we become more susceptible to infectious disease. Lifestyle has a big impact on it. If you're a smoker, for instance, if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, or both, that increases susceptibility to infectious disease. Nutrition, if you're not taking exercise, that also increases susceptibility to infectious disease. Nutrition, of course, is also very, very important in terms of, and what we know is that deficiency of certain nutrients, zinc, vitamin C, for instance, we know that around the world where there is deficiencies and insufficiencies of vitamin D, zinc, vitamin C, then these populations are generally more susceptible to infectious disease. And that's directly as an implication of the fact that these nutrients particularly are very important in supporting the immune system in terms of combating infectious disease. So those are the types of things. Genetics, like the period of life that the person is in, the lifestyle of the person, nutrition of the person. These are the types of things which affect susceptibility to infection.
And I think there's another good follow-on point to that as well, in that it's not just, I suppose, susceptibility to, catching, if you like, an illness, but then also how you respond to that, the severity and the duration of symptoms as well. But everyone can see it across populations. You see that even in this current epidemic with the coronavirus, there's a huge range of responses from all the way from asymptomatic through to, unfortunately, terminal. And so I think, even as you said, all of those factors then feed into that as well.
Yes, and I suppose one of the other things there, Jamie, is that, and I suppose from the coronavirus point of view, I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago who knows somebody who's on the front line. He's a COVID doctor, and he's on the front line, and what was coming back from this was that the one aspect of this disease which is sort of baffling even to the people who are on the front line and the scientists is that somebody might be seemingly doing okay, and they're well and not seemingly in any danger, and then within a matter of hours they're in a critical situation and on life support. And as I say, what this frontline worker was saying, this frontline doctor was saying, that's the sort of thing that they haven't seen before, and it's kind of it's a thing that is, I suppose, scary in that they can't really tell when somebody is going to do this and who is going to do it. So who is susceptible to this what seems to be okay one moment and then severely ill following that. And I suppose, but we also know that there, with coronavirus. And I suppose we could add that to another to the list of where somebody is more susceptible to disease, is that most of the people who become severely ill from coronavirus do have underlying conditions. And we've heard on the news, I'm sure you've heard, that between 25 and 30% of people have diabetes, and that would be type 2 rather than type 1. Obviously, many of them are old and have diabetes or an underlying cardiovascular condition, for instance. And bear in mind, again, that what I was saying earlier on, that as we age, then the efficiency of our immune system declines, and so that doesn't that doesn't help in terms of susceptibility to something like coronavirus.
No, definitely. I understand. And maybe that brings us back nicely to the point we'll get onto now, which is, so you've already mentioned a few nutrients that may be important, particularly if there are deficiencies there. Before we get into that, you've already said it a little bit, but I want to stress this a bit, because I know it can be quite a polarized discussion for some people in terms of when you talk about nutrition for immune function. It's almost as if because you're doing that, you're ignoring all the other aspects, which we're not. We are saying there's so many important areas and factors involved, but obviously today we're only going to talk about some of the nutrition. So I just want to put that there, because you do sometimes see comments like that. So from a nutrition point of view, what are some of the main areas that are important to make sure that you are hitting, or you are optimizing, if you like?
Well, I think that as I briefly mentioned just now, I mean, there are some nutrients that kind of stand out and as being very important in terms of supporting that part and the function of the immune system in combating infectious disease. There's and what is, as a sort of background to that, as a foundation for that, what is known as the insufficiency or deficiency of these nutrients. From an epidemiological point of view, indicates that you do see a rise in these in infectious disease where there's insufficiency and deficiency, and once that insufficiency has been resolved, for instance, then you'll see the immune system and the risk of infection returning to normal. The other thing that I think is also very important about some of these nutrients is that not only do you see the immune system and your resistance to disease or to infectious disease returning to normal when you've resolved any insufficiency, but sometimes with some nutrients, if you increase those concentrations further over and above the recommended amounts, you see an enhanced benefit. And things like vitamin D and vitamin C are examples of that. So let's maybe just crack on, I suppose, with what people would think is probably the most well-known nutrient in terms of prevention or help with infectious disease, and that's vitamin C. I suppose that's the one that we tend to associate with coughs and colds, flu, and so forth. So where does that come from? Well, I think there's a number of things. I mean, vitamin C. Everybody knows that deficiency in vitamin C causes scurvy, and that basically provides the sort of background. You get compromised collagen synthesis, and that provides for an impaired barrier function. And barrier function is very important in terms of protection against infectious disease. An infectious organism has to enter the body in some way, and it has to overcome a mucosal surface, whether that's the gut, the respiratory tract, or the skin. In some way, it's got to get past that mucosal barrier. And it might be, if you like, if you've got a wound on the skin, so you can get infection in the wound. You've got an impaired barrier in the guts, and so you'll get organisms moving past that barrier. And similarly in the respiratory tract. And one of the things that holds that barrier together is collagen, and we know that vitamin C is is critical to collagen synthesis. If it's not there, there isn't collagen synthesis in the same way. The barrier function is impaired, and so you could get a greater risk of infectious disease. What then happens, because you have an infection, vitamin C is one of the nutrients that our immune cells, our white blood cells particularly, use to try and combat that disease. So if you do get an infectious disease, it depletes vitamin C, and that then provides almost like a vicious circle. If you deplete vitamin C, then you compromise the barrier again and raise the risk of a recurrent infection. And so the cycle goes on. So in that sense, vitamin C is very important. Now, when we come on to how vitamin C particularly affects the immune system, we have probably the most important soldiers that we have in our immune systems are our white blood cells, and the most common of those white blood cells are things called neutrophils, and these are the types of white blood cells. They're about 70% of our white blood cells, and what they do, they have this capability to engulf invading organisms, and whether that is viruses or whether it's bacteria, they can engulf those. And what happens then, in terms of once they've engulfed these invading microorganisms, what they have to do is then kill them. And what they use to actually kill these invading microorganisms is what we call free radicals. Now, we tend to think of free radicals as being damaging, but they're actually incredibly important, because that's what our body uses to kill invading organisms. So our white blood cells engulf these invading organisms, and what they do is they put them into a little pocket, and then they inject into that pocket these free radicals, and it's the free radicals that destroy the invading microorganism. Now, where vitamin C comes in is, if we didn't do anything about it, those free radicals, as well as destroying the microorganisms, they would start to destroy the white blood cell as well, because they are free radicals. And so what the white blood cell has is a higher concentration of vitamin C, and the vitamin C acts as an antioxidant, so it neutralizes the free radical. Now, if you don't have enough vitamin C, then what in fact happens is that the neutrophils' function is impaired. They can still kill some of the microorganisms, but they kill themselves as well, and so they're very much less effective in dealing with that infectious disease. So that's really the main mechanism, direct mechanism of how vitamin C combats infectious disease, and probably the most well-known area of infection that vitamin C has an impact on is upper respiratory tract infection, or coughs and colds and flu, and vitamin C certainly has an effect, and so. If you look at, let's say, at a dose of between 100 and 200 milligrams a day, that's basically a reasonably, if you like, prophylactic dose. But where vitamin C has an effect is not really in the prevention of upper respiratory tract infection and coughs and colds, but in decreasing the duration of coughs and colds. And so taking vitamin C at between 100 and 200 milligrams per day can reduce the duration of coughs and colds in adults by about 8%, and in children by 14%. If you increase that concentration, that intake of vitamin C, to between 1 and 2 grams a day, then in adults, it increases that reduction in duration of coughs and colds to 18%. So if you round that up, let's say 20%. So if you've got a cough and cold and you've got it for 10 days, by taking vitamin C a gram a day, then on average, you will decrease duration and severity, but duration by 2 days out of that 10 days. So that's basically the sort of quantitative effect that vitamin C has. And then if we
Yeah.
go on, sorry, Jamie, go on.
No, I was going to say that that comes back to the point we mentioned before, in that it can be, unless we, as we're putting in place these social distance, everything else, it can be difficult to stop the incidence. So how many people get ill? But one of the, I think, the areas of research is really starting to show is what you've pointed out there. What we can do is improve our reaction, our body's response, if you like, to some of these infections.
Yes, and if we stay on that theme, if you take zinc, for instance, as one of the next, if you like, popular nutrients, that also has where it's been found to be very effective is in, again, decreasing duration and severity of an upper respiratory tract infection once it's actually started. Now, let me just go back and look at upper respiratory tract infections. We obviously, there are three major causes, or viral causes, of upper respiratory tract infections. One is the most common is the rhinovirus, and the rhinoviruses cause most coughs and colds, but about 20% of coughs and colds are caused by coronaviruses, strangely. So not the COVID-19 variety, that's slightly different, but in terms of other coronaviruses, about 20% of just general coughs and colds are caused by coronavirus. So we know and understand and are familiar with coronavirus as a type of virus. And then you've obviously got influenza, which is another type of virus. So the rhinoviruses, coronaviruses, and influenza viruses are the three major viral groups that cause upper respiratory tract infection caused by viruses. Coming back to zinc. Zinc is an interesting one. In terms of, from a clinical effect, zinc is again, what you'd be looking at is taking 10 mg a day, and it does show that there is some reduction in incidence, but it's not particularly high. So there's some reduction in incidence of coughs and colds and upper respiratory tract infections. But where it really does seem to have an impact is if you increase your intake of zinc to between 20 and 30 milligrams a day within 24 hours of onset of upper respiratory tract symptoms, it does seem to reduce the duration by about 30%. So it's significant. So one of the sort of take-home messages here is if you start to have symptoms of cough and cold, then increase your, just for that period, immediately increase your intake of zinc to between 20 and 30 milligrams a day, which is 10 mgs, I think, is the sort of daily recommended allowance. So you between 2 and 3 times the daily recommended allowance, but just while you've got symptoms, and the meta-analysis indicates that you decrease your duration of symptoms by about 30%. And just in terms of the kind of mechanism of that, what zinc is really, really important for is the formation of these white blood cells. So if you have an insufficiency of zinc, you don't produce in the body nearly as many of these white blood cells, the macrophages, the neutrophils, the eosinophils, as you do if you have sufficient levels of zinc. And it's estimated that about 30% of the world's population is actually inadequate in zinc, and that might lead, because of infection, to maybe 500,000 deaths a year. But that's mainly in the developing world. In our developed world, if you like, one of the major issues is that zinc deficiency and insufficiency is seen very much within the elderly population. So we're coming back to that area again. The elderly tend to be insufficient in zinc. They don't get enough zinc in their diet. And that parallels the reduction in the efficiency of the immune system. It's a bit of kind of chicken and egg. Is the immune system efficiency compromised because there's an insufficiency of zinc, or is it the other way around? We don't really know. But certainly the elderly population is known to be especially susceptible to insufficiency of zinc in terms of status.
Can I just jump in there, because that chicken and egg concept is actually pretty similar to one of the other supplements I wanted to ask, which is vitamin D. Again, particularly with coronavirus, there is data coming out more and more about the worst outcomes seem to be in those patients who've reported the lowest levels of vitamin D. And like you said, again, could there be other factors contributing to it? Is one leading to the other, or is it just a coincidence they're both low? What's your sort of take on that?
That's an interesting one, Jamie. I mean, vitamin D is one of those, it's almost become the super vitamin over the last, it's for 4 or 5 years, 10 years or so. We used to think of it as being, we understand that it's important in bone formation and in controlling calcium, homeostasis, that sort of thing. But now we know that virtually every cell in the body has receptors for vitamin D. And if they have receptors for vitamin D, then it indicates that the vitamin D is probably having some function on that cell or in the cell. And the more that we look, the more that we find. And what we understand now is that vitamin D is very important in terms of fighting infection, whether it's from bacteria or viruses. And again, what we understand is that it has a major impact on many types of these white blood cells. So it increases the numbers of white blood cells. It increases the aggressiveness of these white blood cells. So when they come into contact with an invading pathogen, for instance, then they're much more aggressive. And similarly, one of the other things that white blood cells produce are these these antibacterial and antiviral peptides called defensins, and vitamin D seems to be very important in the production of it. They're almost like our own intracellular antibiotics, and vitamin D seems to be particularly important in that. And again, if we look at vitamin D, there's been a number of studies, and again, just relating back to acute upper respiratory tract infections, for instance, a recent study has now come to the conclusion that we were talking about vitamin C and vitamin C and zinc, reducing the duration of upper respiratory tract infections, coughs and colds. Well, what this is saying is that vitamin D doesn't really have an effect upon duration of coughs and colds or upper respiratory tract infections, but it really does have an impact on preventing your risk of getting an upper respiratory tract infection, particularly an acute one, such as the current coronavirus might produce. And that reduction in incidence is around about 15%, which is significant, and it's certainly worth taking vitamin D to get that level of reduction in upper respiratory tract infection risk. So and if you think that it's considered now that 30 to 40% of UK adults are insufficient in vitamin D during the winter time. That's a big amount of our population. 30 to 40% UK adults insufficient or deficient in vitamin D during the winter, and about 15% of the population are considered to be deficient all the year round. Obviously, if it's sunny, you can synthesize vitamin D, but nevertheless, and that's why the government a couple of years ago, prior to coronavirus, recommended that everybody should be taking vitamin D supplement during the autumn, winter, and sort of early spring periods. And that now is reinforced even further by the onset of coronavirus, particularly when we have this evidence now that it does have a significant benefit in preventing and reducing the risk of actually getting these infections. So it's a really, really good one. Just one of the things, just adding on to that, just what you were saying, Jamie, about vitamin D having lots of different effects. We did a trial It was called the Vindicate trial up in northern England. And it was a very large trial, and it was looking at intervention of vitamin D in chronic heart failure patients. So there's chronic heart failure patients. And what was found is that most chronic heart failure patients are also simultaneously frankly deficient in vitamin D. And so what we did in this trial was, what was done in this trial, with these chronic heart failure patients, they were given a relatively high dose, 50 micrograms a day of vitamin D over a 3-month period, and then continuing from that. And in that 3-month period, they went from being frankly deficient in vitamin D to being sufficient in vitamin D, and they continued with that vitamin D supplementation. And over the course of the trial, which was over 12 months, there was a significant reduction in cardiac failure events in the people who were taking the vitamin D. So it just shows, although that's not an infectious disease, it just shows exactly what you were saying, that vitamin D seems to have multiple benefits in areas that you wouldn't expect, and particularly where there is an insufficiency or deficiency in vitamin D. And the same thing we saw, obviously, for zinc and vitamin C as well.
Perfect. Listen, I know you're pushed for time a little bit, so what I want to do, we've had, if you don't mind, a couple of questions come in, so maybe we won't spend too long on them, but I did want to just put them to you. And by the way, if people have questions for some of these podcasts, we send out the guests about a week in advance, so feel free to send in some questions. So the first one we've got, it's looking at vitamin C again. So the question was, is it worth taking an antioxidant as well to boost immunity with vitamin C? If so, is it best to take in a combination of the two?
Right. Okay, that's a good question. Okay. How I divide antioxidants up are what I call the endogenous antioxidants that are contained and used by every single cell, and then the phytoantioxidants, which are used by some cells and some tissues, and it's really, really important to get the endogenous antioxidants sorted out first, because, as I say, they are the antioxidants that support all of our cells. And the endogenous antioxidants are glutathione. And glutathione, you don't really want to take that directly from a supplementation point of view. But what you do want to do is take N-acetylcysteine, which is the precursor to glutathione. The reason you don't take glutathione is it's very, very expensive. And glutathione is a tripeptide, and so it's actually broken down in the gut, so you don't actually absorb it. So unless you're taking it intravenously, if you're taking it orally, it costs a ton of money, and you don't absorb much of it. It's broken down into its individual amino acids, because it's a tripeptide made up of 3 amino acids. But if you take the building block, N-acetylcysteine, then what you will find is that as you take N-acetylcysteine, then your status of glutathione, your blood status of glutathione will increase. And there's many studies that have shown that. So glutathione is one. Vitamin E is another one. So vitamin E is our lipid-soluble antioxidant. So glutathione and vitamin C are our aqueously soluble antioxidants. Vitamin E and CoQ10 are our lipid-soluble antioxidants. And then you've got one other, which is really important, which is alpha-lipoic acid. So those 5 are the most important endogenous antioxidants. So vitamin E, CoQ10, alpha-lipoic acid, N-acetylcysteine, and vitamin C. So when somebody is saying to me, what antioxidants should I take? Those are the ones that I recommend, and the reason being is that they are present in every single cell.
Perfect. And then what this last one is maybe a nice one to finish on, and I really like the way that the person sent this in. So I'll read it out as is. It says, straight to the point, top 3 or 4 supplements for the immune system that Nigel recommends.
Okay, we didn't have a chance, and maybe, well, I will in 3 sentences. Of all of those supplements that we've been talking about, I suppose the sort of dearest ones in my heart, where we've done a lot of work, is in probiotics. And what we understand, what we've known for many years, the probiotics can prevent infections in the gut. I mean, antibiotic-associated diarrhea caused by Clostridium difficile, other types of salmonella poisoning, and so on and so forth, all can be the risk of gut infections can be decreased by the use of probiotics. But we've now done 3 major trials where we've looked at upper respiratory tract infection. We did a trial on kids between 3 and 6 years of age, and we did this we published it in 2014. And in this trial, we had 60 kids. We divided them into two groups, gave them our probiotic for a period of 6 months over the winter. We decreased the duration of upper respiratory tract infections, so coughs and colds in these young kids, by 50%. We reduced the incidence by 30%, reduced their absenteeism from school by 30%, and reduced their visits to the doctors by 40%. It was incredible. It was an incredible outcome, and when you see it, when you do a trial like that and you have an outcome like that, I mean, it's incredibly stimulating. And then, literally last year, and we published it as a poster, and it's going into a full paper in the next couple of months. We did an exact replica of that trial, and that's very rare that you see that in the world of dietary supplements, where you have an outcome, and then you do exactly the same trial with the same cohort of kids in terms of 3 to 6 year old kids, the same numbers, the same intervention over the same period of time. And what we found was almost exactly the same result. I mean, that's just incredibly exciting in terms of being able to reproduce that effect. And when the effect was so profound in terms of 50% reduction in duration of upper respiratory tract infections, 30% reduction in incidence. Now, you might say, well, that sounds better than vitamin C and vitamin D, and it is. And that's the really surprising thing. When you look at the quantitative effects, it does seem to be more effective. And this is being shown by a number of meta-analyses that are being done as well. Recently as well, we published a very large trial in Scientific Reports Journal. And the main outcome of the trial was reduction in weight in taking a probiotic product. But we did a secondary outcome, which was upper respiratory tract infections. And again, and this was in adults, obviously, we reduced upper respiratory tract infections by 30%. This was over a 6-month period, taking the probiotic every day. And again, the significance level, and Jamie will be aware of what this means, the p-value was less than 0.0001. So a 30% reduction in upper respiratory tract infection between groups, so placebo control and intervention, and the p-value less than 0.0001. So to answer the point, what would be my 4 top supplements? Easy. Probiotics, vitamin D, vitamin C, and zinc. Easy.
Perfect. Listen, Nigel, I think that's maybe a fantastic point to leave it on. I'm sure we'll get a few questions and stuff off the back of that. And as I said, people feel free to send them over. We'll definitely get Nigel back on again in the near future to talk more about some of these and other aspects as well. As you said, the probiotic one in particular is incredible. They said these aren't just small differences that are, moderately statistically significant. These are real world, meaningful differences, huge measurable differences. As I said, not just something that could be one way, could be the other. If this participant had to have been in that group, and the results might have changed. These are big numbers, and as I said, I think only because of some of the complexities with probiotics and the strain's specificity on some of the claims. I think if it weren't for those type of issues, I'm sure that the regulation claims and stuff like that would be as strong, if not stronger, for probiotics than, as you said, some of the more popular supplements for immune function like vitamin C.
Yes, absolutely, Jamie. And as I say, I mean, it was almost a danger of probiotics becoming a universal panacea. So let's not lose the value of something like vitamin D, vitamin C, and zinc. But let's also not ignore that probiotics sit alongside them just as strongly, and with just as much capability.
Exactly. Nigel, listen, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you taking your time, and I'm sure we'll speak to you again soon.
No problem, Jamie. Have a good day. Take care.